Well, I know that you have received a lot of very important information. Thank you for your presentation, and I am very happy to be here. One, I knew Leon Jett and had the opportunity to work with Leon, both at the Children's Museum and the Idle Jog, and he was one of those real creative souls, and he had a great sense of humor. And Leon and I used to exchange cartoons, usually about racial and political issues. And the last one that I remember he and I exchanging was a cartoon when we were having the big issues about Ebonics as a language. And people were asking, you know, what are black people wanting to do? They want to now speak a different language. There was this cartoon, and I forget where it came from, but there was this black person sitting at a desk with a sign out front that says, "The black person is in. Answers given about your important question." And it said, "Ebonics, $5 extra." And that was my, as I said, my last cartoon shared with Leon. So I was very happy, by the way, to return from sunny Texas, where it was 83 Thursday morning, to come back to this cold weather. This, for me, is a very personal story, basically because Juneteenth, which is, we're celebrating the 150th year of it, is very personal for me. My first celebrations in my life in Galveston and Brazoria, Texas, where my father was from, was around Juneteenth. Now, to start the journey, I have to show you a starting point. This report that I will give will be part history, part genealogy, and part memoir. I'll start with the beginning genealogy. That is a slave ship manifest which shows slaves being brought into Galveston Harbor on a ship called the Palomento. And you'll see the star behind the two names, John and Julian. Well, those were my first ancestors who came to Texas on that ship. When I was growing up, my father's father, who was named Julian, and every one of his brothers and sisters who had a boy child, Julian was someplace in the name. At that point, I didn't know why. Well, they traced it back to this person who came on this slave ship. The other part of the story was that John and Julian were sold from North Carolina to Texas because they were the children of their mother's owner, and they looked so much like the children of his wife that to keep peace in his family, he sold these two boys. Well, as a child growing up, I thought that was fantasy folklore, until during the research on that slave ship, if you will note that one of those boys is listed as brown and the other as yellow. Some of the other slaves, of course, aboard the ship are listed as black and others as brown. So the issue of, you know, all of a sudden, what my grandfather, who had long been dead at that time, his wild tale, I thought, began to make a lot of sense. I have a cousin who is much more into genealogy than I am, and he has done a lot more tracing back to North Carolina and has been able to identify some of the descendants of the slave owner. Now, the next thing is that slave inventory and value. That's not real clear in some instances, but again, you will see the two slaves, John and Julian. One is listed as a carpenter, the other is a laborer, and look, there's a value beside him. Slave inventories are very, very important during that period for two reasons. First, much of the wealth in that part of the country was in slaves. A man was rich because he owned slaves. The other issue as to their inventory is there was a segment of the Constitution called the 3/5 rule, and that slaves were counted as part of the population as being 3/5 of the person for purposes of determining the representation in Congress. So it was a great political coup for the plantation owners to be able to have additional representation in Congress based upon the ownership of slaves. So you see that from the day the Constitution was first instituted, the subjugation and inferiority of African Americans was built into it. As I have worked hard to do this research, I've had many kinds of emotional reactions. Once I went down to, and Marsh Davis would identify with this story. Marsh was in Galveston for a while, and I went down to the waterfront where they were preparing an exhibit on immigration to the port of Galveston, as it was the furthest port west at that time. And I started looking up all the ships. I was looking at passenger ships. And the person in charge, when I told her what I was looking for, she said they weren't passengers. The slave ships were listed under cargo. So being a non-human or an unequal human really, and I was stunned because, again, it shows how much my thinking had to be readjusted in terms of affecting my research, that they were not passengers, and I found out that there were about 20,000 slaves shipped into Galveston within a 6-month period from North and South Carolina, as the abolitionist movement was growing so much there that they were shipping the slaves to Texas, because at that point Texas was not even a part of the Union. They had won independence from Mexico and was, quotes, their own country at that time. The next slide deals with the birth and family information about these two boys, that we know where they were born, we know who they were owned by, and we also know that they were sold. And finally, they were sent to Texas on that slave ship that we started out with. Now, the family information is also something that I and this cousin have been able to do, that we know about the plantations. But then the family tree, which I'm not sure I want to know more about, the next one, that this cousin, who is a chemist, by the way, and much more into scientific stuff, has done the family tree, starting with the slave owner, the slave, and then it seems as though this man had the children by the person who is the slave is all there, even though, according to public records in North Carolina, his wife had 7 children also. But the family tree, which starts there, is something that we look at a lot. Now, once they came to Texas, they were the slave owner we looked up and found out, and he was, of course, a very respected man in his community. And the town of Hawkinsville, which still exists, where that big plantation was, but that plantation was divided up, and some of the people who lived there, the African Americans continued there, were given or purchased land from the Freedmen's Bureau. And some of my father's family still live on land in that area, which they got from the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation is extremely important to look at its assets as well as its limitations. The most important part of it, of course, is that where the first label number 1 is where he declares the slaves free in states that are in rebellion, and it's important to understand that distinction. Then the second part, which I've excerpted, has the territory. Now there's an important thing missing from that. Tennessee joined the Confederacy, but Tennessee's not listed in the territory. The reason is Tennessee had already been captured and was under Union rule, so it was no longer in rebellion. But there were also 4 other states which were slave states: Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and I'm embarrassed the 4th one escapes me now, but there were 4 slave states that did not join the Confederacy. Therefore, the Emancipation Proclamation had absolutely no effect at all in those states, and had almost no effect in the Confederacy, because those states that were in rebellion had elected Jefferson Davis their president, and therefore anything that Abraham Lincoln did not have any effect at all. Now, the beginnings of Juneteenth, and why I consider it a very important holiday in my life, is that the arrival of the Union Army on June 19, 1865, in the port of Galveston was something that is still very much celebrated. There's a lot of debate as to whether they, quotes, got the word late, and therefore they should, and what day should you celebrate January 1, or should you celebrate Juneteenth? My grandfather, who was a cattleman in Brazoria, and a very irreverent kind of person, stated that they weren't waiting for a piece of paper, they were waiting for the men with the guns. And that's what happened on June 19, 1865. The men with the guns arrived. The Union Army arrived with 3,000 soldiers in the port of Galveston, and therefore declared the Emancipation Proclamation in effect. Those 5 orders are important, and every celebration that I went to in my earlier years, we read the Emancipation Proclamation, and then we read General Order 3. General Order 3 declares the Emancipation Proclamation in effect in the state of Texas. But it also did something else. It declared all acts of the Confederacy null and void. It also took control of the commerce. It talked about where cotton was to be shipped and who was going to be in charge. So whereas I knew about General Order 3 as a child, I didn't know about the other 4 orders. And it was because suddenly I said, you know, I know he didn't start with 3, so I'll start looking for the rest of them. And that's when I found that they were 5. And the Galveston Daily News, which still is in existence and states that it is the oldest continued published paper in the state of Texas. I can go through all of their records and find these kind of things. The record of Juneteenth celebrations in Texas is great is something that you can find in June 21, 1865, that was that first 5 orders. Then on June 21st, 1870, there is a celebration, and at that celebration, the newspaper refers to the marchers as 15th Amendment citizens. Well, why would they be 15th Amendment citizens instead of merely emancipated citizens? Well, because in 1870, that's when the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which was kind of the first right to vote amendment. So when you begin to look at history and put it within context of some experiences or things that you know about, that there were celebrations relevant to emancipation, but also incorporating other political events therein. My first Juneteenth that I remember, I was nearly 5, and it represented the first time that I was leaving home without my mother. And you say, that's my first public appearance, and that's my kindergarten class from Miss Brown's kindergarten, which was a month before the Juneteenth holiday, and I am on your left, the second row. And when I say that's my first public appearance, at Mrs. Brown's school, every child had to make a speech on the stage, and it had to be at least 3 lines. Ms. Brown was my very first teacher, and she gave me an invaluable lesson. I was very proud that I arrived at her school at 3 1/2, already knowing the alphabet. And when I announced that I didn't have to learn the alphabet because I already knew it, she said, "Faye Helen, learn them backwards." And to this day, I can repeat ZYXWVUTSRQPON because of Miss Brown. And that she had almost 50 kids, and she was the only person there, but everybody was disciplined, and she always gave me, and I thought that was very creative of her to have me learn them backwards, that you don't need to sit here and and do nothing, because there was always something to do in her class. Now, the story in the Galveston Daily News that day showed what was going on in Galveston, but of course, I was not in Galveston. The reason I was not in Galveston is because I had gone away from home to visit my father's family, who still lived in Brazoria. And that was the first time that I encountered some very special people, because at the picnic, there were about 5 people who sat kind of in a circle, and people went in and talked to them. They were people who had been enslaved, and this picnic was honoring them, and each of them would tell their story. Some of the stories which were later reported to me were about cruel masters. Others were reported about selling their children away from them, or loss of family. But all in all, they also talked about ways in which they had survived and been able to get things done in spite of. One of my father's family persons, who was kind of iconic, was a man named Peter Green. And Peter Green had been owned by the veterinarian in the community. And he learned a lot about the mixtures to help the cows breed, give more milk. He learned about curing chickens they used to say the chicken had the pips. That was like a hip cup or something. And anyway, after he was emancipated, he went into, quotes, business for himself, because he knew all these mixtures. Well, and the joke was that Peter Green built up a whole herd of cattle for himself because he would visit a farmer and to perform certain tasks, and suddenly a couple of the calves would get very sick. And Peter Green would tell the owner that you don't want this to spread to your other cattle, so I will dispose of this one for you. And he would take it home, and miraculously, the cow got well. And they said, and little by little, he built up something where he had a herd of cattle. That was my father's grandfather. My father's father, who left his family because his family were cotton pickers. And he did not wish to pick cotton. He wanted to be a cattleman. So he told us stories not only about his great-great-grandfather who came on the slave ship, but about the cattle riders. He was a person who had big stories about being on a horse that didn't want to go fast, and how he would have his whip and make the horse run faster. So his herd got to the packing house in Houston a lot faster than other people. Well, when you hear stories like that you know aren't quite true, that's why I couldn't accept the fact that he was the slave ship story. Now, every year, for the first years I lived in Indiana, I went back to Texas on Juneteenth, because that was a holy day for my father's family. And if you have never experienced Juneteenth in Texas, or particularly in the Gulf Coast area, there are a lot of celebrations, and people visit places and events where it took place. The last couple of years, I have been able to visit certain sites. In Brazoria, Texas, in a part called Sweeney, there's something called the Freedman's Tree. When I was growing up, the Freedman's Tree was something they talked about, and people would leave other celebrations around and they would visit the Freedman's Tree. The folklore is that when the Freedman's Tree was first identified, it was where the slaves gathered to get the word. That's where the Union Army gathered. They knew the Union Army was coming, and they would they all gathered under a tree. Well, again, gathering on a tree doesn't make sense, but when you think about it, at that point, they had no church buildings on the plantation. They had nothing which they could assemble, so they identified a tree. Well, the Freedman's Tree plantation has now been purchased by Phillips Petroleum, and several years ago, as a result of research from the African American community in that area, they allowed the tree to be dug up, and a young man whose mother's family had been on that plantation is now a wood carver. And Earl Jones, who has done some work for the Galveston Historic Foundation March, he has carved trees all over the county. But the Freedman's Tree, what is left of it, is now in the Brazoria Historical Society, and he is now making little miniature Freedman's trees, and I have a sample of it over there, which contains a part of the ending of the tree. Now, why is Juneteenth important? It is important, I think, not only to Texans, but to the whole country. Texas was the last state to be captured or occupied by the Union Army. All the other Confederate states had fallen by the time they got to Texas. On January 1, 1863, there was something called the Battle of Galveston, and the Confederates won. So that was why the delay in getting the Union Army coming, and it was 1865 before the port of Galveston in Texas was captured again on June 19th. So it is important because it also spelled the end of the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln had been killed 2 months before, in April. The Confederate Army had surrendered prior to that time, in April. So 1865 was not only an important year for Juneteenth, but it also was the official end of the Civil War. And another important thing happened. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. Now, the Texas celebration has spread all over the country now, and there is an effort to make it a national holiday. And several years ago, under the leadership of Bill Crawford, the Indiana legislature adopted a resolution to commemorate Juneteenth. And there have been other institutions in Indiana which are celebrating the day. Once we recognize that it spelled the real ending of the Civil War was when Texas was captured. The other reason it is important is that there is no other celebration of a holiday, national holiday, dealing with the end of this institution, the institution of slavery in this country. Now, luckily, I guess I might say luckily, Texas has tried to amend its ways, and in Texas now, it is an official holiday, and that is the copy of the bill which declared it a holiday in 1979. Thank you. Thank you. And Al Edwards, who is the legislator from Houston, who got the bill through. But there's also a certain irony in this bill. In addition to declaring Juneteenth an official holiday, it also declared Confederate Heroes Day. But that's what fusion, politics, and compromise does for you. Strange bed, when they say politics makes for strange bedfellows. So if the Confederates could have their day, we could have our day in Texas. But hopefully, the holiday being declared in Texas is the beginning of a move to make it a federal national holiday. Now, the other thing I want to say is that many of the white community in Texas have observed Juneteenth. As a child, I was very aware that the women who worked in homes, the domestic workers, were given the day off. Now, and I know there's at least one friend of mine who's here who grew up, Kathy Gibson, who grew up in Jasper, Texas. My first conversation when I met her and was talking about my going to Texas for Juneteenth, she remembered that her family, who were long-term Texans, had to explain to the Northerners coming in why they had to let their maids off on June 19th. But my first job on a June 19th was being a substitute bus girl at the Galvez Hotel, because the older blacks took off on that day. And my grandfather, who loved to talk about being free, he was born in 1872. There was no other holiday he observed. You got no Christmas gifts, you got no birthday gifts, but on June 19th, he became a very generous man. Okay. Well, I hope that I have enlighten you somewhat on my particular journey in many ways. And I still enjoy celebrating Juneteenth, and it brings back bittersweet memories in some ways, but also the fact that my family and friends still celebrate. And the word Juneteenth came into vogue about in the 1900s. Before then, it was just called Emancipation Day. But it became Juneteenth because people wanted to reflect a more generous, fun spirit. Thank you.